with the talk on Taketori monogatari, all right, the tale of the bamboo cutter. Everyone ready? Everyone has the handout. Okay, so beginning today, we will be looking at the Heian period. All right, this is the next of the periods of Japanese history that we'll be looking at in this course. This period began in 794 and lasts for a relatively long period of time, for about 4 centuries, all right, ending toward the end of the 12th century. All right, today, we will be looking at an example of one of the earliest monogatari, all right, one of the earliest monogatari. Heian period, you will find as we look at it through this course that new heights are achieved in literary and also artistic creativity. We will see developments in Buddhism. New sects of Buddhism will start to spread across the country. All right. So let's begin by looking a little bit about the history, the social background, the developments that we see in the early Heian period, and then we will move on through the period. Right. The early Heian period, the dark age of Japanese literature. This is how scholars refer to the first 100 or so, 100 to 150 years or so of the early part of the Heian period, really beginning from the Nara period through the early Heian period. Why is this period called the dark age of Japanese literature? And I emphasize the word Japanese. Why do you think this would be called the dark age of Japanese literature? What kind of literature would have been emphasized rather than Japanese literature? We talked, yes, Chinese literature, because we talked in one of the earlier lectures how much cultural exchange took place between Japan and Tang China. Remember, in the Nara period, really prior to the Nara period, this begins. And then all the way through the Nara period, and then through the early part of the Heian period, we will see a great deal of exchange, literary, cultural exchange, taking place between the two countries. Right? So during this period, the dark age of Japanese literature, it's really Chinese literature that is focused upon. And when I say Chinese literature, I mean especially Chinese poetic composition. Right? So this is going to be the standard of the day. This sets the standard for the Japanese. Right? So they look to the Chinese, they look to the Chinese texts, classical Chinese texts, as their standard. This was especially supported and encouraged by a number of the early Heian period emperors. Probably Emperor Saga is a name that many of our Japanese students would be reminded of when we speak about the Chinese learning and poetic competition and composition that takes place. We will see that poetic competitions also take place during this period. And official collections of Chinese verse were ordered by the imperial court. Right? So Emperor Saga and a number of the other emperors of the early Heian period will order official collections of Chinese-style poetry to be written and compiled, right, for the court. Right? So these are official Chinese verse anthologies. I'm going to move rather quickly through this. This is not material that you necessarily need to memorize. Right? This is intended to give you a background, right? A brief glimpse of the social, political, historical, cultural background of this period. Okay? The reading material that I give in this lecture, that I give out in this lecture, contains most of the material that is covered in the early part of the lecture today. However, all right, in 838, right, so this is at the turn of the century, we start to see a decline in the number of missions that are taking place, the missions that are being sent to Tang China. Remember that in the Nara period, we saw a number of official embassies being dispatched to the Asian continent via the Korean peninsula. There were other routes. They were all sea routes. Remember that they were very difficult undertakings. Travel in those times was difficult. But that was not really the main reason for the decrease or the decline in the number of embassies going to Tang China. The Tang dynasty itself was on a decline by this time. All right, so by and by, the missions slowly start to come to an end, and officially they will end in 894. So around the turn of the century, at the end of the 9th century, we will see an official closing of all, termination of all of these embassies, official embassies to the Asian continent. So what do you expect happens after this? There is now going to be a renewed focus on Japanese poetry, right? And I emphasize the word Japanese. So we're talking about waka, right? The kind of poems that we saw in the Manyoshu, right? The 31-syllable form of poetry, of verse. This is the kind of poetry that will now be emphasized, not only at court, but in general, generally speaking. We also see new prose forms developing. And this is what we'll be talking about today, right? The new types of prose. Now, the production of the new literary forms, the new genres in this period, was particularly helped by one certain development, right? One particular development, and that would be the development of kana, right? Kana. All of you are familiar with hiragana and katakana, I'm sure. And most of you probably know that both hiragana and katakana, both scripts, were actually derived from kanji characters, right? From Chinese kanji characters. Both of these scripts, for different reasons. Right? Here in the image, we have characters that are probably, generally speaking, familiar to all of you because they look very similar to the hiragana that we use today. In the Heian period, when kana was first developed, there were actually a great number of kana, right? Many more than we use today. Right? They were all derived from different kanji. So for one particular kanji sound, a number of kanji might have been used originally to represent that phonetic sound. For example, the phonetic sound a, as in a, I, u, e, o. So we would have several kanji perhaps representing the sound a. You can imagine that it would be very tedious and very cumbersome to have to write a long text completely in kanji, right? Because they would require a large number of strokes. So by and by, it became simpler and more convenient to write a simpler form of that kanji. Right? And in the Heian period, and in periods after the Heian period, we will see that a number of the forms are used, a number of forms are used to represent those sounds. Right? Nowadays, however, there are only about 50, right? 50 forms. So there's one particular form that we use for each phonetic sound in the Japanese syllabary. Right? There were more in the olden days. Okay? And it is this development of kana that becomes the vehicle for court women to write the new forms of literature that we see develop during this period. For example, we see poetry, the waka, right? And then diaries, monogatari, right? Etc. We will also see examples of essays, essay-style writing, essay-type writing developing in this period. Right? And it's women of the court especially, women of the nobility, who will proceed to undertake most of this development. Not, I shouldn't say most, but much of it. Right? So they're going to be responsible. They're the ones now setting the scene. They're on the stage, ready to develop now these new forms, these new genres. However, we should remember that Heian male courtiers, right, men of the court, would still write in the official language, and that would be kanbun. Okay, so Chinese text, Chinese writing is still the standard of the day, and we need to remember this. Okay? The women would write in kana, and kana was sometimes even referred to as literally woman's hand, onnade, right? Because it was primarily the script for women to use. Okay, if I move on, everyone following along? No? And so, let us look at a few of these new forms of literature, new genres, new collections, etc., new works. The first of which that we'll look at, imperial waka collections. Right? Again, imperial is the key word here. These would have been ordered by the court, so probably ordered by an emperor in reign at the time. The earliest of the waka, imperial waka collections, is the Kokin Wakashu, right? Kokin Wakashu, compiled at the beginning of the 10th century. Right, and here we have an example of the first poem in the collection. It is a springtime poem. Right? The collection is divided up into several scrolls. Right? The first 4 scrolls correspond to the 4 seasons of the year. Right? And then the Kokin Wakashu will be followed by several other imperial collections of waka poetry. You do not need to memorize any of these titles. Right? Just know that this is the beginning of 21 imperial waka collections that will be ordered by the court through the Heian period and thereafter. We also see during this period the uta awase. Right, this is going to be the poetic competition, the match that I was referring to a while ago. Uta and then awase, meaning to have the 2 teams of poets meet together and then compete by composing and then reading aloud their poetry. Okay. And then the poetry would be judged, usually by a predetermined poet who has been selected as the judge of that particular poetic contest, poetry contest. All right, so a winner is usually announced, and then in most cases the judge is going to give some commentary on the particular poem that was read, why it was selected as the winning poem, etc. And then we also see byobu-uta. All right, byobu-uta, and these are going to be poems that are based on the content of folding screen paintings. If you've been to a temple or a traditional home in Japan, you will probably come across examples of the folding screen, byobu. Right? These are sometimes 6-paneled, at least several panels in the folding screen. And on the panels you will find illustrations, paintings, usually of natural scenery, birds, flowers, trees, the animals, so forth. And by this time in Japanese history, the poets tended to turn to these kinds of scenes, illustrations, paintings, etc., as the material for them to work with in composing poetry. What change does this represent? What change do we see in the way poetry was attempted in the Heian period compared with the Nara period? In the Nara period, if you recall, I mentioned a number of times that the poets would tend to go out on their own, right? Travel, experience firsthand nature, their surroundings, the hardships of travel, for example, and then they would write about those firsthand experiences. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen in the Heian period and later. It does. It does continue to happen, of course. But by and by, you will see a trend for poets, a tendency for them to stay indoors sometimes, perhaps take part in a poetry match, uta awase, perhaps take part in some sort of poetry gathering at which the poets would sit around and contemplate what is depicted in the painting on the folding screen, on the byobu, right? And then compose their poems based on that experience rather than first-hand experience. So that is one difference we see. All right. The other new development is the writing of diaries. Right? Journals were kept. This is not particularly a brand new development. right? So I should correct myself. Diaries and journals were kept, right, by people in the earlier periods, but for different purposes. Usually the diaries and journals in the earlier history would be official journals, journals that would be kept for work. Right, so official courtiers would keep a diary or keep a journal and record the events of their day-to-day affairs as they would work for the court, for example. These would be mainly male courtiers. So men of the court would keep official diaries. However, in the Heian period, we begin to see new forms of the diary. All right, we begin to see more personal journals, journals that record personal memoirs, personal events experienced by the author, by the owner of the journal. One of the earliest examples of the Heian period diary and a new form of the diary would be the Tosa Nikki, right? Tosa Nikki, written by a man named Kino Tsurayuki. Kino Tsurayuki was actually one of the main chief compilers of the Kokin Wakashu, the first of the imperial waka anthologies. And then this is going to be followed by several more major diaries, considered major by scholars today, Kagero Nikki, Izumi Shikibu Nikki, and Sarashina Nikki. Again, you don't need to remember or memorize any of these titles. I just wanted to give you a feel for the increase in production of this type of journal. Right? Now, Kino Tsurayuki was a man. Right? The other names here are women's names. Okay? So in most cases, the major diaries and journals of the Heian period are attributed to women. Right? It was the women who kept these diaries and journals. And that makes sense because they are of a more personal nature, right? They record perhaps the events that a woman experiences in her marriage, right? The difficulties that she might have encountered in life at court, etc. Right? But the very first of these, it is interesting to note, is written by a man. Right? And there's something else about the Tosa Nikki that is a little bit interesting and that we should take a few moments to contemplate. Right? So Tosa Nikki, a Tosa journal. What kind of journal was it? Well, it describes an unnamed governor's return to the capital from finishing a 5-year term in Tosa province. Tosa province is present-day Kochi prefecture on Shikoku Island. So it's going to be a little bit south of our area, of the Kansai area. So he has been dispatched to Tosa province. He spends 5 years there, right, with his wife. His daughter goes with them on the journey, but unfortunately, she passes away. He loses his daughter while he and his wife, his family, are in Tosa during his term as governor. This becomes the theme of the journal itself. All right, the loss of his daughter, his beloved daughter, the sadness, the feelings of loss are depicted in the many, many poems that are contained in the Tosa Nikki. Right? Kino Tsurayuki was one of the leading poets of his time, so it's not surprising that he would have been selected by the court to help compile the imperial waka anthology, Kokin Wakashu. And it's not surprising that his own diary, journal, contains some 60 poems, right? And most of them center around this theme of loss, right? The loss of his daughter. However, there is one other point that is interesting to note about the Tosa Nikki, and that's why I chose this particular journal as one to look at in a little bit more depth. Tsurayuki actually writes not as himself, as the author, but as a woman. Right? So he takes on a woman's persona, right, and speaks as a woman, and he writes in Japanese prose, right, rather than kanbun. So this is a deviation, a departure from past practice. Remember that I mentioned that it was the official journal written by men, right, that we saw earlier on. Right? And most likely, since it was an official journal, it probably would have been written in kanbun, because that was the official language of the day. But Tsurayuki deviates from this, and he writes his journal, Tosanikki, in Japanese prose. And in the opening lines, he says something like this: I intend to see whether a woman can produce one of those diaries men are said to write. Okay. What does this indicate? Well, Tsurayuki, as a man, ordinarily would be writing his diary, if he's going to keep a diary, a journal, in kanbun, right, the official language. However, he decides intentionally to see, speaking as a woman, right, whether I, as a woman, can produce a diary as well. And he writes it in Japanese prose, so he's probably going to be writing it in kana, right, rather than kanbun. So what does this indicate? Well, we see an elevation in the status of Japanese prose compared to Chinese text. Right. Previously, really this was just the realm of, this was limited to the writings of women, right, their personal writings. Right. So the importance of using Japanese prose, especially kana, the kana syllabary, becomes elevated by this time, and the writing of Tosanikki by Tsurayuki, a man, helps to elevate the status of the Japanese prose used in literary writing. And then, finally, today, we will be looking at this particular type of literary work. This is a new literary work developed in the Heian period. It is narrative fiction, narrative fictional writing, and we term it monogatari in Japanese. All right, the first of which that we will be looking at today, next week, and then the following 2 weeks. The first of the monogatari we'll be looking at today is the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, right? Taketori Monogatari. Compiled or finished, completed sometime toward the late 9th century or early 10th century. It's not known exactly when. And this is not uncommon when it comes to the early monogatari, the early works of literature in Japanese history. So we don't know for certain. We don't know the author as well. Right? So this is an anonymous tale as far as the study of it is concerned. We don't know these days who was responsible for originally penning this work. This particular monogatari is considered the parent or the ancestor of all monogatari. All right, so it's the first, and we will see in a minute why. All right, it's considered the parent or the ancestor of all monogatari to come. The other one that we'll be looking at, and this will be next week, is Ise Monogatari. Ise Monogatari, and this is the tales of Ise, compiled a little bit later, probably early 10th to early 11th century. Again, we don't know exactly when. In the tales of Ise, the episodes, there are many. Right? It's really a collection of short, very short, succinct, compact episodes. Right? They form the many, many chapters comprising the tales of Ise. And each of these episodes, not always, but often, you will find it beginning with a certain line. There once was a certain man, mukashi otoko, so a man of long ago, a man of former times. Right? So this is how the episodes will begin. We'll see that next week. Right? There is a presumed model for the tales of Ise. That would be Ariwara no Narihira, right? A Heian court poet, an actual person who existed, lived in the Heian period. He is the presumed model for the tales of Ise. Okay. And then, of course, we will be looking at Genji Monogatari. And that will be about, in about 2 weeks or so. And we will spend at least 2 periods looking at Genji Monogatari, the tale of Genji. Penned sometime, completed sometime in the early 11th century. Usually the date given is 1008. Right? So 2 years ago, in 2008, we had a number of celebrations marking the anniversary, right, the anniversary, 1000th anniversary of the writing or the completion of Genji Monogatari. Right, this one, written by a woman, Murasaki Shikibu. We do know the author. Right? She was a court noblewoman who served in the court of Shoshi, who was the consort, one of the consorts, one of the wives of Emperor Ichijo. Right? And as most of you know, this particular novel is considered a masterpiece, or the masterpiece, of Japanese narrative fiction. And we will see that its main storyline deals with the amorous relationships of its hero, Hikaru Genji, his political gains, and personal losses that arise as a result of those political gains. So he's successful at court, but he does have to make some sacrifices, personal sacrifices, as a result of those gains at court. Okay, so we will see that in a couple of weeks. Okay, so for now, let's go ahead and look at the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. Right. Again, an anonymous tale. We don't know the author. Written late 9th to early 10th century. There are a number of theories, but there is no direct evidence supporting those theories. So we don't know exactly when it was written. You will see that it is a tale of unrequited love. We've been talking about this particular theme a number of times in the course. We saw it in poetry. We saw it in part in the early part of the lecture. Unrequited love. Monogatari, for example. Right? Monogatari, in the end, he is successful. Right? He is successful, and he is able to marry the woman that he finds at Kiyomizu-dera. Right? But this theme, it's a recurring theme. Right? We will see it again and again in the literature. And again, it's the earliest example of a monogatari. Why do we know this? Well, for example, if you look at the tale of Genji, right, the tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari, there is actually a reference made to the tale of the bamboo cutter within it. Right. In this particular chapter of the tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, the chapter is called A Picture Contest, E Awase. So rather than uta awase, we have a competition, comparing to illustrations. Right, to illustrations. And the two illustrations that were chosen were two from the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, and then the other from Utsuho Monogatari. So two monogatari were chosen, and one of them was Taketori Monogatari. This is how it's described in this chapter of the Tale of Genji. The first match was between an illustration for the bamboo cutter, the ancestor of all romances, and a scene centering upon Toshikage from the Tale of the Hollow Tree, Utsuho Monogatari. All right. So, ancestor of all romances. If you look at the original, we have Monogatari no ide kihajime no oya naru. Oya. Oya meaning parent, right, literally. Right. Here, Side and Sticker has translated this as ancestor. Right. So, the ancestor of all romantic fiction. And here meaning monogatari in particular. Okay? And then in the following passage, from the left came this view. So we have the left and right sides competing in this e awase. The story has been with us for a very long time. So by the early part of the 11th century, right, we know from this passage that the tale of the bamboo cutter had been around for some time. It was well known. Right, and treated as one of the works of literature that would be appropriate, right, for entering into a competition of this sort, e awase. Okay. So it was not unknown at all to the people of the Heian period. Now, let's move on. So first, we will be looking at the birth and discovery of the heroine of this tale, and that would be Kaguya-hime. All right, so the birth and discovery. If you will turn, please, to your handout. This is going to be page 2 of your handout, bottom left-hand side. And if you'll read along with me, let's see how Kaguya-hime is discovered. Once upon a time, there was an old bamboo cutter who went into the mountains and fields, cut bamboo, and put the stalks to all kinds of uses. His name was Sakaki no Miyakomaro. Now it happened that one stalk of bamboo shone at the base. Puzzled, the old man went up to it and found that the light was coming from its interior. When he examined it, he saw a dainty little girl, just 3 inches tall, sitting inside. Because she is here in this bamboo I cut every morning and evening, I can tell that she is destined to be my child, the old man said. He put her in his hand. She's just a dainty little thing, so he puts her in his hand, took her home, and gave her to his wife to rear. She was the cutest thing in the world. The wife kept her in a basket because she was so tiny. Stop there for a second. Dainty little girl, when she's born, she's just 3 inches tall. We see similar stories of unusual births in the Japanese folk tales, the folklore, the legends of past. For example, we have the story of the boy Momotaro, right, who was born and discovered in a peach. Right, a peach comes rolling down and is discovered by an old man and an old woman. Right, so we do see similar stories of unusual births. This should be a hint to the reader that Kaguya-hime probably is no ordinary young girl. Right? She's probably no ordinary young woman, and there's probably more to her than meets the eye. Right? So this is the first initial hint of her real identity. And then we also find a number of references to, for example, let me back up a little bit. One, bamboo shone at the base, all right, so something is shining. Light was coming from its interior, right? And then the old bamboo cutter keeps finding stalks with gold inside them, right, after the discovery of Kaguya-hime in that bamboo stalk. So again, these are also hints to the reader of what is coming ahead. Right? There is probably more to Kaguya-hime and her identity than meets the eye. She's probably no ordinary little girl, even though she's born just 3 inches tall. The child shot up swiftly while they cared for her. This is also unusual. Right? By the time she was 3 months old, she was as big as an adult, so they put up her hair and dressed her in a train. They looked after her with great solicitude, making sure that she never emerged from behind her curtains. The incomparable beauty of her face and figure filled the house with radiance. Let's stop here. This particular line perhaps needs a little explanation, making sure that she never emerged from behind her curtains. Why? Because in this period, noble women, in other words, female members of the aristocracy, the elite, would usually remain hidden behind a veil or a curtain, a screen of some sort, especially if a man might be calling. A man might be calling, making a visit in courtship with the woman. Right, so they were usually required to remain hidden from any visiting men. Right. Now, the other line that we need to focus on in this particular passage is the last one. The beauty of her face and figure filled the house with radiance. All right, so a couple of slides ago, we saw that the bamboo that Kaguya-hime was discovered in, was shining at the base. It was, there was light coming from it, light coming from the interior, and then the old bamboo cutter finds gold in the stalks after her discovery, and she herself, all right, radiates, right, this glow, right, this shimmering beauty. This can all be seen as probably the author's attempt to portray Kaguya-hime, our heroine, as the ideal woman. Ideal in terms of Heian standards. Right, so Heian standards for women of the aristocracy, for members of the elite. I've been mentioning that there is probably more to Kaguya-hime than meets the eye. Indeed, we will find that she does seem to possess abilities that are perhaps superhuman. Right? She is able to do things that an ordinary noblewoman would not be able to do. An ordinary human woman would not be able to do. Right? So she could be seen as a heavenly being, and we will find at the end of the story that she is indeed a heavenly being, one having superhuman qualities. Okay. In fact, her name is also a hint of things to come, right? and a hint as to her identity. The kagu, word kagu in Kaguya Hime, her name, actually means to shine or to shimmer radiantly. It is said to share the same word origin as kagiroi and kagayoi. So the word kagu in her name. This is also something that we will see in other works of literature as far as the names of the characters are concerned. For example, a while ago we had looked at the story of Princess Karu, right? Princess Karu. Karu no Oiratsume, or Karu no Iratsume. There is another name given to this woman in the legends, in the folk tales, and one of those names is Sotori no Iratsume. So, here, and then Tori no Iratsume. Right? It's the same woman that we saw in the tale of the two siblings that enter into an illicit affair in the Kojiki. And she was so named Sotori no Iratsume because supposedly her beauty shone. It was so great that it would shine through her garments. Garments here referred to as so, and then toru, which means to pass through. Right? So her beauty was such that it would shine through her garments. Okay, so this is another example of the same sort of thing. Right? The name is indicative of the character, right? The personality or the aspects, right? The shining, shimmering qualities of the heroine. Now, in the Nihon Shoki, it's interesting to note that Sotori no Iratsume is an alternate name given to another woman, right? Not Princess Karu, but actually her mother. Right? So the wife of Emperor Ingyo and the mother of Prince and Princess Karu. Right? So again, there are different versions. Okay, now we will see, however, as we look at the tale of the bamboo cutter, that you might imagine, right? You can expect that a woman of such beauty, right, incomparable beauty, beauty that is shimmering and shining and radiant, you would expect that she's going to have a number of suitors, right, calling upon her. And we can look at this as an example of kyukon, right, kyukon. All right, so it's just a request made by these many suitors, these multiple suitors, a request for Kaguya Himen's hand in marriage. All right, so we are going to find in the story that multiple suitors, in fact 5, and then also the emperor himself, are going to compete for Kaguya Hime's hand in marriage. All right, this is seen as kyukon. However, all of them, as we have found out, are going to be unsuccessful in their attempt. Even the emperor himself is unsuccessful. In the Manyoshu, we see a similar tale, and it's not only in the Manyoshu, but we see similar tales of a maiden that is caught in a love triangle, if you will. She is caught between 2 or more men, right, who are competing for her hand in marriage. In the Manyoshu, we have the tale of a maiden caught between 2 men, the youth of Chinu and the youth of Unai, and ultimately, the woman in this tale, the course of resolution that she selects, she chooses to drown herself. And this is also not uncommon, right? That women in the past, in ancient times, would ultimately turn to suicide, and it would be suicide by drowning, right? Throwing oneself into a river or another body of water. This kind of theme is something that we also see repeatedly in the literature. Okay? But For now, let's focus on Taketori monogatari, and let's look at how one of the suitors, right, competes for the maiden's hand in marriage. He is given an assignment. He's given a task, right? And that task was to search for the jeweled branch and to bring it back to Kaguya-hime if he wanted to be successful in obtaining her hand in marriage. Right? So this is his task. So if you'll turn to your handout, page 2, bottom right, and let's see how Prince Kuramochi fares in his attempt. Right? Prince Kuramochi was an artful man. To the court, he submitted a request for a leave of absence so that he might visit the curative baths of Tsukushi. To Kaguya-hime's house, he sent word that he was going to fetch the jeweled branch. Then he departed from the capital. So he intends pretty much to fabricate this entire story, right? That he has actually gone, found the jeweled branch, and that he has brought it back to Kaguya-hime. He has completed successfully his assignment. Right? But indeed, it's not the case. Right? 3 days after his pretended departure, the prince came back again in the boat. He had already called in the 6 best metalsmiths of the day and had built a house in an inaccessible spot and set up furnaces inside 3 sets of walls. Now he brought the smiths to stay in the house, joined them there, and supervised the fabrication of a jeweled branch. All right, so it's a phony, it's a copy, an imitation, using all the resources of his storehouses and 16 estates. He had them make the branch exactly according to Kaguya-hime's specifications. Then, having managed the whole affair with the utmost resourcefulness, he sneaked into Naniwa. Naniwa is the port, right, that he would enter and then make his way up to the capital to return to Kaguya-hime. The prince sent word of his return to his mansion and sat around looking exhausted. All right, so he's putting on quite a display here. He's quite the actor. A throng of people came to greet him. They put the jeweled branch in a chest, covered it, and bore it toward the capital. Kaguya-hime, as you might imagine, was astonished and upset by the prince's arrival with the branch. And now, next, she's speaking to the bamboo cutter. I asked for something hard to get because I didn't want to be stubborn about refusing you, because she has no intention of marrying either Prince Kuramochi or any of the other suitors as well. But the old man, completely convinced that Prince Kuramochi has brought indeed the true jeweled branch, he's completely convinced, so he begins to make preparations for the wedding. Right? But the old man arranged for the bedroom to be decked out. What kind of place was that tree growing in? What a rare, beautiful object, the old man said to the prince. And after this, we will find that the prince proceeds to tell the old man a fictitious tale of traveling to a place called Mount Penglai in search of this jeweled branch. Right? Penglai is usually referred to in Japanese as Horai or Horai-san, and it was considered by the ancient Chinese to be the land of immortals in the Eastern Sea. So a magical kingdom, a magical location inhabited by immortal beings. Okay? And we see in the literature similar tales in which the protagonist, right, the hero or the heroine, will make his or her way to a magical kingdom, right, inhabited by immortal beings. For example, we have the story of the fisherman Urashima Taro, right, one of our familiar Japanese folk tales, who rescues a sea turtle and is led by that turtle to an underwater kingdom inhabited by immortals. In this tale, we find that Urashima Taro lives in the magical kingdom for a time with a beautiful princess, right, for 3 years. But eventually he becomes homesick and he asks to return to shore for a brief visit. Right. Once there, however, he finds that he has actually been gone for 300 years. Right. This is a familiar theme, probably a familiar storyline, not only when it comes to Japanese literature, but other world literatures. Right? You probably know of stories in the literature of your home country that talk of similar events. So once there, however, he finds that he has actually been gone for 300 years and there is no trace of his home or family. Right? In despair, what does Urashima Taro do? Well, he breaks his promise with the princess, and he opens this enchanting box that he has been told by the princess to leave closed, leave alone, if he wishes to return to the kingdom, return to her, to this life of immortality under the sea. Of course, as you might expect, the moment he opens the forbidden box, Urashima Taro promptly loses his youthful appearance, and he becomes an old and wrinkled man. So as human nature might dictate, he is not able to resist the temptation, and as a result, he loses the chance for immortality. Anyhow, so we see tales like this of men traveling to an underwater or some other magical kingdom inhabited by usually beautiful, immortal women. And that is the case with Prince Kuramochi's fabricated tale, right, of Penglai. So back to the handout, page 3. This is going to be the right-hand side, right, a little ways up from the bottom side of the page. I saw the faint outline of a mountain, right, in the middle of the ocean. Everyone in the boat was transfixed. It floated on the water, a great peak, high and beautiful. I kept the mountain under observation for 2 or 3 days. Then a woman dressed like a heavenly being emerged from its depths and began to dip water with a silver bowl. I disembarked and asked the mountain's name. "This is Mount Penglai," she said. I saw flowering trees of a kind unknown in this world. A stream with waters of gold, silver, and blue flowed from the mountain. It was spanned by a bridge of many colored jewels, and there were shining, glittering trees growing nearby. The tree from which I broke this flowering branch was a sadly inferior one. The delights of the mountain were inexhaustible. Nothing in the world could compare with it. But I couldn't wait to leave after I picked the branch. And now I've come here without even changing my brine-soaked robes. And so this is the tale that he has fabricated. But, as we discover soon, this conniving, Prince Kuramochi is discovered rather quickly. His deceit is discovered. Just then, 6 men filed into the courtyard. One of them held a letter on a stick. "I am Ayabe no Uchimaro, a smith from the office of palace works," he said. "I fasted and labored with all my might for more than 1,000 days in order to make the jeweled branch, but I still haven't received any recompense. I still haven't received my pay for making this jeweled branch as you ordered. Reward me so I can reward my helpers." He held up the letter. Kaguya-hime had been growing more and more distraught as nighttime approached, but the smith's demands for payment made her laugh with joy. So she's laughing gleefully now that Prince Kuramochi's deceit has been uncovered, and she will no longer have to enter into marriage with this man. So in high spirits, what does she do? She composes a reply in the form of a waka poem to the prince's original poem. So the prince has read to her a poem of his own, and in response, this is her poem. Let's look at it. Makoto kato kikite mitsureba. I thought it genuine. I thought, in other words, that the jeweled branch was genuine, as I thought your words sincere. Koto no ha o kazareru tama no eda ni zo arikeru. So, but the jeweled branch, like the leaves of your words, stems from a tree of deceit. What is happening here? Well, in this poem, we see the use of a poetic device, usually referred to as engo, use of related words. Words, in other words, having a common denominator. For example, in this poem, we have branch, and then in Japanese, eda, right? And then we also have leaves. So, koto no ha, and then ha, literally meaning leaves. Koto no ha here is a reference to the words spoken by Prince Kuramochi. We have the word in modern Japanese kotoba, right? Kotoba. And so koto no ha meaning words, the words spoken by Prince Kuramochi, and then ha in koto no ha meaning leaves. So there is a relationship between eda and ha, right? They both are parts of a tree. And so this is the kind of poetic device that we will see frequently being used in poems of the Heian period and thereafter. Right? We don't see this as much in the earlier poetry. Okay, so this is what she has, this is the type of poem that she has composed in response to Prince Kuramochi, and now she is free, right, free from marrying him. Okay, ready to move on? So, what can we glean from this? This is probably an example, a good example of the type of story in which we see nandaimuko, right? This particular theme, nandaimuko, the use of riddles, tasks, difficult assignments to counter suitors. Right? Now, we have seen this somewhere else in the literature already. Right? In this particular story, Kaguya-hime gives each suitor, her 5 suitors, an impossible task. And in this particular story, none of them succeeds. Right? We saw how Prince Kuramochi failed rather embarrassingly. And all 5 of the suitors are going to meet a similar fate. Where else have we seen nandaimuko? Where else in the literature? Anybody? The use of riddles, tasks, sometimes in the form of poems. Someone say it? That's right, monogatari, the otogizoshi that we looked at in the first lecture of this course, was another example of nandaimuko. Right? Now, in that particular story, monogatari is successful. Right? He is able to, due to his wit, his talents in poetry and literature, especially in poetry, he is able to solve the riddles that Jiju no Tsubone poses to him. Right? In this particular story, the suitors are, unfortunately for them, not as successful. Okay? Now, in the conclusion of the story, what do we see? Well, we find that Kaguya-hime must now return to the moon. Right? This is her home. Right? A celestial palace on the moon is where she has come from. This is the home that she must return to. All right, so let's look at this. This would be page 5 in your handout, left-hand side. All right. Kaguya-hime has told the old capital that messengers from the moon will come for her on the 15th of the 8th month. The bamboo cutter has asked the emperor for help. All right, so the time has come for Kaguya-hime to make her journey back to the celestial palace on the moon. Right, it happens to be the 15th of the 8th month of the lunar calendar. Does anyone know why? Why perhaps the 15th of the 8th month of the lunar calendar would have been chosen? Tsukimi. And why do we, even today, take part in a Tsukimi event? Tsukimi meaning moon viewing or moon watching. Why? At this time of the year. So under the lunar calendar, the 8th month corresponds to Chushu, the middle of autumn, actually. Right? Because the lunar calendar is off by about 1 month when compared to the Western solar Gregorian calendar. All right? So actually, the 8th month, August, is not summer, not midsummer, but mid-autumn. So the moon supposedly was particularly bright and particularly round right around this time of the year. Right? So this is going to be the 15th of the 8th month, so the night of the full moon during mid-autumn, Chushu no Meigetsu. Right? We still celebrate to a certain degree Chushu no Meigetsu today. Other Asian countries probably do as well. Right, so this particular full moon, this time of the year, was seen as being particularly round and bright. Right, so one that was celebrated. So Kaguya-hime now must make her way back. Right, so at this point, her parents learn their daughter's true identity. Okay, Kaguya-hime is not a human, but rather an immortal, celestial being who must now return to the moon. Okay, so let's see how this happens. Now, this is Kaguya Hime speaking. All right, so page 5 of your handout. It must be because our karma affinity was short that I have to leave so soon. It won't be easy to go without doing anything for my parents. These days, I have kept going out to the veranda to beg for permission to stay just this year, but my appeals have been rejected. That's why I've been so sad. I can't bear to go away knowing I've been nothing but a bother to you. People who live in the Moon Palace are blessed with beauty, eternal youth, and freedom from care, but it doesn't make me happy to be going there. I want to be here when you get old and feeble. Okay, now, let's look at this particular word before we move on. Karma affinity. A reference to karma affinity is something that you're going to find in the literature of this period and later periods time and time again, especially in the monogatari that we look at in this course. We will see it again in the tale of Genji. Can anyone explain to me what karma affinity means here? We actually saw it earlier as well in Monokusataro. We did see it there. I didn't mention it in detail. Can anyone give me an explanation of karma affinity? Why is she talking about karma affinity here? This is a Buddhist concept, Buddhist idea that refers to the bond that people believed they had from a former life. Right? So a bond to someone or something, some event in their former life that would predetermine, dictate how things would go in the next life. Right? So their fate, destiny, was believed to be predetermined by the person's actions in a previous life. Right? So this is the karma, the bond that is going to be mentioned time and time again in the literature, especially of the Heian period. Right? And we'll see why when we talk about the tale of Genji, why this reference is repeatedly, frequently used. Right? In Japanese, it can be referred to as sukuse or shikuen. There are several different terms. But this is something that you will probably want to remember. All right? So be sure to jot this down. All right? Karma affinity, the bond from a former life. Okay, now, everyone got that? Yes?
I understand that it's like what is karma, but what does it mean that affinity was short?
Was short because we didn't have a strong enough bond, all right, to keep us together for a longer period of time. So our particular bond was not one that was strong enough for me to stay on earth with you. If our bond had been stronger, if we had had a better karma affinity with one another, predetermined from our previous lives and previous actions, then I might have been able to stay on earth with you. Unfortunately, we were not as lucky in this case. Our bond was not strong enough for me to stay on earth.
So it's just about a bond between people? Or?
Right, essentially, yes. But it's dictated from that person's actions in their previous life, right? And there's a Buddhist concept notion that one goes through a cycle of lives, a cycle of stages, right? And from one life to the next, you have certain bonds that would dictate how your life would go in the next stage, the next life. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, now, I gave out an assignment last week for you to be thinking about, and this would be the topic for group discussion at the end of this lecture today. Let's go ahead and give you a few minutes to be thinking about this together as a group. You have been divided up into groups of 3 to 4. These are the questions that I would like for you to be thinking about. Right? We have not looked at the final conclusion of this story. Right? This is for you to be thinking about. Discuss with your group members how Kaguya Hime is portrayed at the end of the story, right, as she prepares to return to the moon. And how does this compare with her character and behavior in the earlier chapters? Right? Does Kaguya Hime exhibit certain qualities or behavior at the end that she didn't exhibit before? What kinds of thoughts and emotions does she express at the end of the story that she probably would not have or might not have expressed earlier during her stay on Earth? Okay, this is what I'm looking for. All right. So please think about this, discuss this with your group members, and in about 10 or so minutes, I'll ask for some comments from the floor. Okay? Okay, go ahead and begin. Okay, I've been coming around and listening to your discussions. Most of the groups seem to have arrived at similar conclusions. Okay, if I could ask maybe one or two groups to give me a few ideas, let me know what you've concluded, and then we'll probably spend the first few minutes of the next lecture continuing this discussion. I think you are on the right track, but maybe we need to practice finding specific examples in the literature to help support our conclusions. Okay, so I'm asking you to find specific actions, specific thoughts, specific emotions, all right, that are displayed or expressed by Kaguya Hime at the end of the story that would support your conclusions. Most of you, I think, have arrived at pretty much the same conclusion. But I need to hear a little bit more detail. I need to hear more specific examples in order for me to be convinced, right, that that is indeed the conclusion that can be drawn. Right? So let's go ahead and hear from a couple of groups. How about this group over here with Lao-san? Lao-san and your group? Anybody in the group is fine. More human-like, okay? And how so? What specific examples in the text do you find? She feels sorry for the old man, okay?
Because the old man asked Kagashima to take him to the moon with her and
so she's sorry to leave. She expresses regret leaving the old man and the old woman. That's right. So she expresses and displays human qualities, human emotions toward the end of the story, especially as she is about to depart for the moon. Good. Now, let's look at this. One more time. It must be because our karma affinity was short that I have to leave so soon. It won't be easy to go without doing anything for my parents. So this is probably one example that you could cite. These days I have kept going out to the veranda to beg for permission to stay just this year, but my appeals have been rejected. That's why I've been so sad. One of our other groups mentioned that Kaguya Hime expresses sadness, right? Something that she might not have done, probably would not have done earlier on. Let's hear from another group. All right. How about I don't know. How about Yurian-san's group? What else do you see in the literature?
We mostly have the same idea that she shows a lot more human sides. Also that she shows appreciation of being or having been on Earth.
Okay.
Which she before didn't do because she just tried to distance herself from the normal conduct. But now that she has to leave, she seems to realize that what she's experienced is also something she can appreciate.
Okay, and so appreciation for these human qualities, right? Human emotions, and human behavior. What else do we see in the text that would indicate this, that is evidence of her display, her expression of human emotion? I've underlined two particular examples. Right? I can't bear to go away knowing I've been nothing but a bother to you. How about the next line here? But it doesn't make me happy to be going there. I want to be here when you get old and feeble. So, as Yulian-san mentioned, she now understands what the old man, the bamboo cutter, and the old woman have done for her. They have raised her. She now is able to appreciate, right, what has been done for her. She would now like to return the favor. Right? This is something that she might not have done earlier in the story. Another group mentioned a while ago that Kaguya Hime earlier on in the story expresses selfishness. She displays selfish behavior. Yulian-san also mentioned that. Good. The next passage, we meant to have her stay only a short time. This is the king talking, but you have received much gold over many years and have come to be quite a different person. This is the king talking to the bamboo cutter. Kaguya Hime had to spend some time in your humble dwelling because she committed a sin. Now that the sin has been expiated, now that the sin has been paid for, she has paid for that sin by spending time on earth, we've come to fetch for her. You can't stop us by weeping and wailing. Send her out right now. We have taken care of Kaguya Hime for more than 20 years, the old man answered. It's odd that you should talk about a short time. There must be somebody else called Kaguya Hime. He still cannot accept the idea of her returning. All right. The king brought the carriage to the roof without bothering to answer. Kaguya Hime, why do you linger in that unclean place? He said. The locked strong room door flew open in a twinkling. Now I'm going to stop here and pose another question for you to be thinking about by next week. Right? I would like for you next week to sit with the same group members, right, from the beginning of class, so that you can continue this discussion. There is a line here, why do you linger in that unclean place? Right? What do you find in the conclusion of this story, right, that indicates, that is indicative of the king's perception of the bamboo cutter's world? Right? What kind of depiction is being made of Earth, of the world of humans, right, in contrast with Kaguya Hime's world on the celestial palace in the moon? Right, so I would like for you to be thinking about this contrast, right, and why it's being made. Why is this contrast being made? As well as, I would like for you to continue looking at the text. Right, look at the text at the conclusion of the story, and please try to find specific examples in the text that indicate how Kaguya Hime, at the end of the story, does indeed display more human-like, humanly behavior. Right? There are other examples in the text. This is an exercise that hopefully will help you when it comes time to write your term paper. Right? Because this is the kind of thing that I will be looking for in your term paper. The ability to find specific examples, the ability to cite specific examples in the text in order to support your ideas. Right? I'm not going to say that someone is right or wrong when it comes to interpreting a passage in the literature. Right? That's up to you, and I don't have the authority to say with 100% certainty that someone is right or wrong. It's up to you to convince me, all right? To convince me by citing specific passages, specific examples in the text. Okay? There are other examples in the text if you look closely. Okay, we'll stop there, and if you don't have any questions, we'll see you next week. Please bring the handout, all right, on the tail of the bamboo cutter to class next week.